So welcome everybody here to this session on the role of government in the impact economy. Yes, our intention today is to put the spotlight really on the unique contribution of the government in the impact economy and the impact ecosystem. And as Eva explained earlier, this topic really is important to EVPA, as we've been working on cross-sector collaboration with government engagement for a long time. And we just launched the Collab Award, and where also we find that in system change and collaboration, government plays an increasing role also in collaboration with our members. It is also a great pleasure for me to welcome Irene Basile from the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. And she will highlight some areas for government action based on the OECD entrepreneurship policy tool the OECD developed in partnership with the European Commission, and share insights and recommendations for very concrete action based on international experiences. Before we dive deeper into the topic, it would be great to see who is in the room, and indeed see whether there are some people from government possibly in the room. That would be very nice to welcome you here. Can I just ask Sona to please launch the poll? And if you tick, don't forget to submit actually your responses. That can happen sometimes. So what type of organization do you work with? Is it an international organization? Is it a national government agency, a regional or local government agency, an investor or funder, an intermediary, a network, a support organization, or an impact organization? I think we can see whether some results are already coming in. Can we show the results? Oh, interesting. Yes. So that is an interesting information. So far, we don't have anybody from government here in this room. And it shows actually, and we have a lot of intermediaries in the room, also a few impact organizations and a few others, as well as representatives from international organizations. That is very interesting. And I think some of the topics that we'll discuss apply equally to the other groups. It's not only for governments that we share this information, but it is also for us to understand better how we can engage effectively with government. So I'd like to share some ideas on the role of government, on ecosystem building and collaboration. So the starting point here would be to say that governments actually have an interest in developing conducive market environments in which all actors contribute to the greater good that can thrive rather than supporting individual organizations. So this is where we're looking at the impact economy from this market's perspective. So what are the markets that need to be developed? So let's start with the perspective of the impact organization, a social enterprise or cooperative or an NGO. They supply goods and services that generate impact and in return, ideally generate some revenues. They respond to the needs by beneficiaries and the demands by so-called impact purchasers. Yesterday, for example, we heard from corporates who procure some or all of their office supplies from impact organizations. That was an interesting example, and there are many more. Other important impact purchasers are indeed government agencies. So by their procurement or partnering with impact organization, they actually pay also for the impact that is produced by the impact organizations. And even yourself, you are an impact purchaser when you buy sustainable products in the shop. So if revenues generated in these markets are not sufficient to cover costs of operation and investment, impact organizations need access to external finance So impact organizations obviously have different needs, but also the funders and investors differ greatly in terms of their individual impact, risk, and return profiles. So ideally, these needs and the investment strategies match. And to make them match, intermediaries play a really, really important role. So you have, for example, financial advisors that help the investors to make the right choices in which impact organizations to invest in. You also have financial intermediaries, platform providers to match the investment needs or the investment capital with the needs of the impact organizations. But also on the other hand, you have support organizations to the impact organizations or support organizations that help actually the impact organization access markets. So that brings me to my next point. These markets actually don't function as I described them just now. And you know this very well. When you look for funding, you don't find an investor who's interested. You're told that your project is too risky, too small scale, and you don't find your way in the jungle of programs or government regulations. Or maybe the procurement rules put you at a disadvantage. You're not even able to access government markets. So this is actually when governments can play a huge role, where these market mechanisms fail or markets don't even exist or the impact can be enhanced. This is where government can greatly influence the dynamic of this market system. So it really plays a role across the entire impact economy. What I'd like to say here is that often we think about government as the market regulator. So those who set policy, that promote, that sets rules and standards and provide subsidies. But actually the government is also a very, very important market participant. They fund, they invest, they procure, they deliver, and they bring impact innovation to scale. We'll hear more about this, for example, as the government as a participant in the session on EU instruments just later. They also procure services, as I said earlier, and there are many examples of government investment or co-investment instruments. But also government can act as a market facilitator and should actually act as a facilitator to inform, to build the capacity, to convene and to coordinate. So there's a really, really important role, which is why you often find in more mature impact ecosystems, you find actually cross-departmental institutions that just look after the impact economy. You find strategies that work for the entire sector. You have stakeholder convenings by governments because they have a really important convening power. The second point I'd like to make here is that government interventions do not necessarily need to be directed only at impact organizations. But we can see that from in many countries, government initially, when they started to build the impact economy, they focused indeed on increasing impact capital, the impact capital, so the supply of impact capital. For example, in the UK, they facilitated the establishment of a wholesale fund. In France, you had pension fund regulations that were to channel mainstream capital into the impact economy. So that was a really an important aspect. And nowadays, thankfully, also there's much more emphasis on supporting the intermediation, which we have seen earlier, which is extremely, extremely important. Also, there's a lot of work going on building and allowing impact organizations to access government procurement. This is actually a really important point. Ecosystem actually don't develop over time. So they develop mostly in phases. And in some places, governments have taken the lead in building and creating these impact ecosystems. In other places, industries association have played a major role, and certainly we as EVPA hoping to make our contribution as well. Immature ecosystems are characterized by isolated activities, lack of intermediation, a lack of suitable offers on the supply side of the impact capital markets. That means there are simply no impact investors around. As the ecosystem grows, you find not only more in terms of numbers, but also more sophisticated and better connected players, better designed financial products, stronger and financially more sustainable intermediaries, as well as increasing leadership from the side of government. To build an ecosystem, it is not only important to understand at which stage your ecosystem is currently in, but even more importantly, where you would like to go in the future. So I'd like to ask you to just close your eyes or make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine a situation, say in 10 years' time, in which your country's ecosystem will be much more mature. What are the key features? What are the key characteristics that your dream impact ecosystem should have? I give you a few seconds to think about this, and it would be wonderful if you could share some of your favorites into the chat. What would you like the ecosystem, the impact ecosystem in your country to look like? What would be the features if you had to describe them to someone else, and proudly maybe describe them and say, we have that and that and that in our country? Any ideas? Yes, that's an interesting one from Eva. We certainly hope that social enterprises will have a vast spectrum of financial instruments available for their business. Exactly, so they can choose, they can find exactly the kind of financing that they need. They don't need to please the investors, but actually they can choose and say, oh, this is exactly what I need, and I don't need to become more commercially oriented just because otherwise I don't get any financing. So I can do exactly what I want. A collaborative environment. This is very interesting. And actually, I'd like to come back to that later on, where stakeholders work together and develop accessible financial instruments. So it is really about the collaboration, about different stakeholders making it work. And integrated, okay, that is also goes in the direction that many more mature ecosystems are developing into, which is really integrating the economy with the institutions, the banks, and the people. So then you wouldn't have the impact economy on one side and the mainstream economy on the other side. But eventually, don't we all hope that eventually impact will become mainstream? Awareness, significance of social impact, growth, and responsible consumerism. So keep writing and keep sharing these ideas. That is very interesting. And we'll come back to that later on. So I would like to give you an example from the impact economy in the Netherlands. They did an exercise to look at the growth in different phases of the impact economy in the Netherlands. And they looked at the number of social enterprises, the number of publications. They looked at the networks. They looked at knowledge, capacity building, finance actors, as well as relevant policies. Putting something like this together by the stakeholders together, rather than just an individual consultant, can actually mean a big push for the ecosystem in terms of ecosystem awareness and connectedness between players. And that brings me to my next point that was already mentioned earlier in your comments. We talk a lot when we talk about government interventions or ecosystem building, we talk a lot about instruments, specific policies, etc. But it is also very, very interesting and important to look at other factors that determine the strength of your impact ecosystem in your country. That is the connectedness and quality of relationships between actors, the power dynamics, and the narratives in a society. Just to give you an example for the latter ones, if in a society there was a narrative that earning revenues and making an impact on society exclude each other, then it will be very difficult to establish tools, instruments, and policies that, that foster the impact economy. And vice versa. Maybe in your countries, there are policies and programs in place that, for example, support women entrepreneurship. But then a women entrepreneur who looks for money may find that decision makers in financial institution or venture capital funds that, by the way, all mostly have men in decision-making powers, they have an unconscious and a conscious or unconscious bias towards them. And they may also find that they have a less stronger peer network, or they're not accepted in the existing peer network in their environment, in their communities. Or maybe their families and friends discourage them to engage in a risky endeavor and much rather recommend that they start a secure job in government or big corporation. My last point is about understanding the importance and strengthening the relationship between the actors in the impact ecosystem. In this figure, you see a visualization of the relationship in a country's entrepreneurial ecosystem based on a social network analysis carried out in 2018. When you look at the upper part of the figure, you see that many of the interviewees that took place and that took part in this exercise are pretty disconnected and work in isolation. Whereas the lower part, the organizations are much more connected to each other. The isolated dots, it turns out, by looking at the numbers, reflect mostly entrepreneurs in rural areas with weaker economic and academic educational background. And it also turned out that entrepreneurship support has been mostly concentrated in urban centers. These entrepreneurs benefited more from strong connections to peers, mentors, entrepreneurship support, and they performed significantly better than the other peers that have been isolated. So looking at relationship and dynamics provide important information for government, but also for other ecosystem builders when they intervene in such an ecosystem. When we talk about relationships, there could be different objectives for relationship building that matter in ecosystem. Firstly, it could be about improving connectedness. So this is really to understand who is there, who is around, to create a sense of belonging and peer support. The second level is about coordination that increases transparency on who is doing what in the sector, where are the overlaps, and where are synergies. And the third level is about collaboration, where you have actors jointly work together on an agreed agenda. Both parties put their resources to play, and there are great synergies, hopefully. And to finish this presentation, I just like to zoom in on one form of collaboration that is important to collaborate for impact, but also our work with the European Commission, the public-private partnerships, where a public agency works with private and philanthropic investing for impact community in different ways. As for all collaboration, it is important to design partnerships in a way that the respective strengths are brought into play. For example, many of our members work with governments in instances where they pilot more risky social innovation projects that are then brought to scale by government agencies. For example, a new approach to education for disadvantaged children that is then rolled out across the country with the help of government agencies. And you see some other strengths that are important to such collaborations, such as access to resources and expertise. So with that, I would like to hand over and welcome on stage Irene from the OECD, who will share with us some insights on the great work that the OECD has been doing in this area for many, many years, both on policies and social entrepreneurship, as well as impact investing. Irene, very welcome.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you to the European Commission and EVPA for making this possible. It's very exciting for me because it gives us a chance to reflect upon policies that support both social entrepreneurs and impact investors at once, which is something that still rarely happens today in this silos world that we live in. And me, myself, personally, just to introduce myself, I've been working at the OECD for 4 years now. And I started by working on impact investing in the framework of development cooperation. And right now I'm working within the social economy and innovation team of the OECD, in particular on a global action that we are running to promote the social and solidarity economy ecosystems. So I'm going to make an effort to liaise and summarize a bit of all the work that I've been doing over the years at once on impact investing and social entrepreneurship. Next slide, please, Sona. Thank you. So, as you know, probably know, the OECD has been working on social impact investment since 2013, really. And in the 2015 report, which first set out a distinct typology to differentiate social impact investment from conventional investments, we proposed this market framework that you see here on the left. I'm not going to dwell much into it because Anya already described it even in more depth, but the idea is that we should start by addressing social needs. And typically, of course, on the demand side, this implies service delivery organizations, which often include social economy actors such as nonprofits, social enterprises, social purpose organizations. And on the supply side, we have a growing supply of capital, a growing number of capital providers that are interested in impact investment, of course, as a means to diversify the portfolio and to pursue at once financial and social goals. Now, the key is that the general framework conditions in a country will have a significant impact on the development of these financial as well as real markets, both in general and for the impact economy. So these conditions are generally heavily shaped by governments in their role, which can be either as a market regulator, as a direct participant, or as a facilitator building those collaborations and connections that Anya discussed previously. Now, despite the increasing importance that is being publicly internationally recognized to both social investment and social entrepreneurship, we see at the OECD serving our governments and partner countries that very often policymakers struggle to build conducive ecosystems and even to access those good practices at the international level, which are a source of inspiration. And throughout the years, the OECD has worked both on impact investing and on social entrepreneurship and has developed an analytical approach that has proved helpful in supporting governments in their policymaking efforts. What you see on the right, this colorful wheel, is extracted from the Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool, which is an online platform free of access that was co-developed by the OECD and the European Union and launched in 2018. On this platform, you can find policy guidance notes as well as case studies on both inclusive and social entrepreneurship. It also features the possibility for anyone who is interested to take a short self-assessment free of access to assess, to verify what is the current policy environment in your region, city, or country. So I encourage you to have a look. And now, as you can see, we're gonna have a short poll that is just really a teaser of what the actual assessment is like. So now if you can please launch the poll. We wanted to see with you. Yeah, there you go. In your country, which of the 7 policy dimensions that are featured in the Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tools should become priorities to support both social entrepreneurs and investors. This is obviously a simplification of what the tool can offer. but just to get a sense of what, according to you, should be the priority for your policymakers, since most of you aren't policymakers, but you probably see what the needs are on the ground. So what do you think should be prioritized? If it is improving the legal and regulatory framework, fostering both the supply and access to impact finance, access to markets, which can be both public and private markets, developing skills, capacity building, improving impact measurement and reporting, or more broadly, fostering that common culture that can happen through, convening, connecting, disseminating knowledge. I'm going to leave you a few seconds to answer. You can, of course, tick more than one option, because indeed we try to have an ecosystem approach. So the idea is that there's no one solution, but it's a whole system that needs to be built to support the emergence of these markets. Sona, do you think we have enough answers? Let me know. Yep, here we go. All right. Well, I see finance is taking away most of your preferences. Good to know, but the regulatory framework as well is having a strong importance, and capacity development, very interesting. Whereas the others are more or less tied, access to markets, impact, and a conducive culture, which sometimes is perceived as a bit of a remaining framework sort of feature that permeates through all the other ones. Thank you. Again, if this was interesting, I invite you to look at the tool. What we thought of with Anya is that we would zoom in on 3 aspects that are really key in building those connections between impact investors and impact entrepreneurs at once. So there are 7 dimensions in the policy tool. I'm going to focus on just 3 of them, if you allow, for the interest of time. And those are in particular regulations, finance, and impact, which actually were also among the top priorities that you mentioned. Next, Sona, please. Yeah, those are the 3 dimensions. And now just moving on to the first one, regulation. Of course, the onset of impact-oriented markets largely depends on the existence of a broader investment and business conditions which can relate to competition, trade, taxation, corporate governance, responsible business conduct. And even among OECD member governments, legal restriction can still hamper the flow of capital to social purpose ventures. So at the next slide, thank you, Sonia, I'm presenting to you just some early reflections that come from what I mentioned. No, back one slide, sorry, yes. From our early work on the OECD Global Action promoting social and solidarity economy ecosystems, which amongst other things focuses on regulatory frameworks, and that will actually result in policy guidance that will be disseminated next year. So what we know is that, of course, the country's legal and regulatory framework has a significant impact on the visibility, recognition, and credibility of social enterprises. It also serves as a reference for suitable public support schemes, whether it is in terms of access to procurement and financing, for instance. However, there's a wide variety of approaches across countries. In the Global Action, we look at 34 countries that include all member states, all European member states, as well as Brazil, Canada, India, Korea, Mexico, and the United States. And what we have seen is that the various models and legal options that have been adopted, there are traditional forms, legal forms that belong to the social economy that have been adopted in almost all countries. And those are associations, cooperatives, mutual organizations, and foundations. And the associations and cooperatives in particular are the most frequent ones. But more recently, countries have started, of course, to develop specific legal frameworks for social enterprises, either by introducing new laws, as it happened, for instance, just to name a few, in Belgium, in the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, Slovenia, but also through simply adopting strategies and action plans that provide a working definition or that foster the system of accreditation and a registry. This happened, for instance, in the Netherlands and Sweden. There are other countries where the recognition of community-based initiatives has been fostered, for instance, in Brazil and India, but also in the United States and Canada. And these entities and initiatives can be recognized as linked to the social economy, the solidarity economy, or also known as the third sector. They can stem from the national or local level, of course. And in other cases, there can be legal forms that are independent from the formal recognition of a social economy strategy, for instance, as it is the case in the United States. So there are many options. And beyond the legal recognition of entities, of course, governments can also intervene to shape the financial, fiscal, and procurement conditions. So especially on the financing side, this can help improve the ease of doing business in general, and especially for mission-led enterprises. For instance, by opening up new sources of financing. Recently, for instance, Italy, Singapore, and Thailand have adopted measures to facilitate equity-based crowdfunding for startups. And that's a whole new channel of financing that is opened up through legislation. There's fiscal regulation, of course, that can offer tax privileges to social enterprises. And there's the important issue of opening access to public and private procurement markets, which is a key source of income generation, not only through outcome-based contracting, social impact bonds that are very much at the forefront of media and policy discussions today, but also more in general by integrating social and environmental consideration in public procurement processes. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sana. So the Better Entrepreneurship tool offers a self-assessment exercise, as I mentioned, and for each policy dimension, it identifies a number of success criteria, let's say, which need to be fulfilled for the ecosystem and that policy dimension to be considered mature. And in particular, when it comes to regulation, creating an enabling regulatory framework, of course, social enterprises should be recognized in one way or another, whether it is formally or more at a working level. And there are many legal forms that can be chosen, but they are needed for them to operate and to enter into contractual relationships. So legislator can adopt specific legislation, as I said, or they can develop statuses or registration systems that still help them identify and become visible. To facilitate the use of a variety of existing legal form, it is also important to consider removing unnecessary barriers and restrictions that might actually be hidden in the legislation and regulation. For instance, sometimes legal forms are subject to restriction that prevent enterprises from engaging in training, receiving equity capital, establishing subsidiaries, or remunerating their directors. So these can create some difficulties, and it is important for policymakers to identify them from the start. The content of the legislation that is being considered should, of course, be suited to the needs of social entrepreneurs. And for this reason, it is important to, before approving a legislation, to consider an extensive consultation process that involves potential social entrepreneurs and their representatives. And this inclusive consultation process will obviously also ensure that the legislation or regulation is ultimately also implemented and adopted. And
Irene,
finally,
I know you still have a lot of information to share with us, and I think we have to hurry up, unfortunately, a little bit. Why don't you just mention the other two areas briefly, and then we just can discuss a little bit more into detail about some potential pitfalls and maybe also opportunities to engage
Indeed.
with government on this.
Thank you, Anya. So the next critical dimension is, of course, access to finance. And here I just wanted to share with everyone the policy framework that was adopted in 2019 that also provides a detailed list of policy options that policymakers can adopt to foster impact investing. And as you see, even here, what I wanted to stress is that only one typology concerns the direct provision of finance. Many other policy initiatives concern actually just building a conducive ecosystem to policy setting, regulation again, and disseminating information. So it is important to always have this comprehensive approach. At the next slide, we see that this is a mapping that was done in 2018 and that shows that increasingly public policymakers are adopting impact investing, not only domestically, but also in cross-border relationship as part of their development cooperation initiatives. And you can check out the report online for more information if you're interested. Next slide, Sona. Right, so this is again the Better Entrepreneurship tool, which, as I mentioned, details the conditions that can hamper, that can foster access to finance for social enterprises. I'm not going to dwell on each one of them, but there's way more information if you want to take the survey or if you want to read the specific guidance that is also provided. Next slide. And concerning impact, of course, impact, the hunt for impact is a defining feature of both social entrepreneurs and impact investors. But what impact means is still very, very debated, and how to measure it. We know that funders' requests are a driving factor when determining which methodologies will be adopted by social entrepreneurs. But that means that very often they will not prioritize their internal learning needs. So there's a balance to be found between external accountability and internal learning for social entrepreneurs that is often difficult, especially because there's a variety of methodologies available, of definitions that often do not stem from the social economy sector itself. And public authorities have a really important role to play there. What we see as part of the OECD Global Action, again, the impact measurement is one of the work streams that we are zooming in on. And we are performing here again a policy mapping. And we have identified a number of pillars that governments can think of when they try to promote impact measurement, both for individual social enterprises, but also at the ecosystem level. And once again, this means, first of all, embedding impact and impact considerations in the overall policy frameworks. So not just adopting a strategy to promote the impact market or adopting social procurement regulations, but actually enshrining the need for impact and ring-fencing resources so that impact measurement can be undertaken also at the field level by those direct service providers. Of course, governments can directly support the dissemination and the creation of open access guidance tools, impact measurement tools, and their harmonization. There has been a quite extensive effort, for instance, in Canada to develop a common approach to impact measurement. It's a great case study to look at in terms of extensive consultation to develop a community-driven approach that is also very flexible to the needs of different social purpose organizations. Governments play an important role in the creation of evidence, of impact measurement evidence themselves. So that means mandating studies at the sectoral, regional level or country level, but also building those repositories of knowledge, like for instance, through what work centers, as it happens in Australia and the UK on different, even smaller topics than just the social economy, you know, whether it is active aging or reduction of criminal recurrences or education. And those are very important to foster that accumulation of evidence and to promote evidence-based policy making, of course. And finally, to always consider capacity building. Sorry, just to say that, because very often we see many incubators that are, you know, acting as connectors, as facilitators of finance, but they also need to incorporate impact measurement competencies and foster their skills development in this dimension.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Irene. And I know there's so much more to learn. I actually shared the toolkit on that is on the website. I also shared the link to the OECD impact investing publication that has like all the policy measures listed there that have been identified in a wonderful exercise. So I really recommend you have a look at all this data that is available. Also in relation, there was actually a question also on the tax benefits. You find there is quite a lot of information on this in the OECD publication, where they really reviewed the different regulations also in more detail. So you find more about this here. Unfortunately, we almost have to close now, but before we close, I'd like to ask Irene about maybe from all this work that you've been doing, could you share with us some nuggets, some experiences, recommendations, pitfalls to avoid when working as government, or maybe also working as an intermediary with government, a social enterprise with the government, about what is really the key areas, what can be done, what is the first priorities that could be done?
One mistake that often captures our policymakers is to think that, you know, a one-size-fits-all approach can solve, or that there is a silver bullet, you know, so to adopt one initiative, one legislation that will magically solve all problems. And what we really recommend is to always have an ecosystem approach. So to look at all these dimensions and to have a thorough mapping beforehand, either of the legal opportunities, the procurement opportunities, the financing opportunities, and to look at them both from the demand and supply side, whether it is of capital or of social goods and services. So to have, first of all, a thorough mapping to understand the state of the land, right, and to understand which barriers exist, and then to get into, to start the reform or the policy making process or the spending program, so that is based on an actual understanding of what are the needs and the resources available. I think that is something that is cross-cutting to all types of policy initiatives.
Yes, indeed. And maybe I can just respond also to a second question that was coming here about adoption of a specific new law and what could be potentially the disadvantage. And I'd just like to combine it with a response also about what is feasible and recommendable to do to create impact systems and policies. I think it's also a good way to start with a lean approach, not start with a very comprehensive reform that requires a lot of approval from different departments in government, but also just start with what is feasible on a small scale.
And what is behaviorally smart. Because you can introduce something, but if there is no interest for the parties to actually adopt and engage, then it might be an empty shell. And we see those that just add a layer of complexity, but then are not so much implemented on the ground.
Thank you so much, Irene. I think this was a great session. I think it gave us all a feeling for the broad range of work that has been done, that is out there, that we just need to look at and use, but also the great work that will be done in the future on impact, on legal frameworks as well, that will be published in a few months. So this is wonderful. I'd just like to wrap up and sum it up a little bit. We found that the government can engage in various different ways. There's no one size fits it all. It is really about taking this market approach. You made wonderful recommendations in the chat about your dream ecosystem. It was very much about mainstreaming, about ecosystem awareness, about collaboration, cutting across silos, and also for the government really to take a more active role, as well as what I found quite interesting, the use of technology that can help us to create conducive ecosystems. With that, I would like to hand over back to Eva to take us to the next sessions, which will also be very exciting and dive deeper into the topics that we just touched upon. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I mean, for me, the picture of the iceberg, Anya, that you presented, I think it really shows the complexity, right? Because we often look at the legislation and instruments. And as you saw it, there is so much going on underwater, and all those dynamics and relationships between different stakeholders. I think this is super important, right? That we don't stop at this, let's say, material level, but we really go deeper, right? And understand better what is happening among all those stakeholders. Not everything can be captured in a legislation, right? In a document. So thank you so much, Irene, for your contribution. I encourage actually the audience to use the Better Social Entrepreneurship tool, because I used it 2 years ago. I was in the pilot group, we were testing it, and we did some exercises with the Polish organizations, and it's really helpful. What you get as a picture of the ecosystem, a good material for further discussions with different stakeholders. So thank you so much.